welcome to this week's edition of Walter Rodney Groundings, the television organ of the Working People's Alliance. The Amila Falls controversy continues despite the pullout of Site Global, the company that was responsible for seeing the project through. The president announced that he was trying to get the APNU, through its leader, to come to a common position with the other two parties. The APNU held a press conference and reiterated its objections to the Amila Falls project. The Working People's Alliance, WPA, our party, held a symposium on the Amila Falls project. Professor Clive Thomas and APNU's economic spokesperson Carl Greenidge were the presenters. They both insisted that the project was ill-conceived and so therefore it should be scrapped, and that a new approach should be taken whereby the government, the opposition and civil society get together and come up with a broad strategy for hydroelectricity in Guyana. Word has come out that allied to the Jam Zone celebrations, or whatever you choose to call it, this month, there is now something called Loan Zone, where banks are making loans up to $150,000 available to people, mostly young people, so that they can buy tickets and buy all the other things that they need to attend Jam Zone. And the 1823 Coalition for the Monumental Parade Ground held a march earlier today from Le Recevenir to Parade Ground Georgetown. At the march, they reiterated their commitment towards building their own monument and rejecting the monument that was built by the government. They also linked the 1823 rebellion and resistance to the present situation in Guyana. And Buxton has announced that they would be honoring A.U.C. Kwayan himself, a Buxtonian, this coming Wednesday, the 21st, at the Friendship Primary School. A.U.C. Kwayan, of course, is one of the founder members of the independence movement, having been part of the original PPP that was formed in 1950. His political career spanned over 60 years, and he has made a monumental contribution towards the shaping of political culture and politics in Guyana. These and other stories I'll be discussing with my special panel today, and both of them are no strangers to us. Tokumo Gunse is an executive member of the WPA and himself a spokesperson on a number of issues as they affect Guyana and Guyanese. He's a regular contributor to the letter sections of the Kaitro News and the Stabrook News. And my next panelist is Freddie Kisoon, columnist for the Kaitro News, political commentator and activist. Gentlemen, welcome to Walter Rodney Groundings.
It's a pleasure to be here.
David, it's always nice to connect historically to a party that helped to form my conceptualization of politics, life, etc. It's really an honor to connect to the WPA in whatever way, substantial or thin. I am quite elated to be here and will be happy to be here anytime.
Right, welcome home, Freddie. Freddie was once, as he said, was once a member of the WPA through the 1970s and the 1980s, and has always continued to be a supporter of the party in whatever we do. Let me start with you, Freddie. Amila, we are at a point where the AFC and the government voted to push the project through. The APNU voted against. Site Global pulled out and said that it no longer wants to be part of the project if there's no national consensus. Economists such as Carl Greenidge and Clive Thomas, along with political commentators such as Chris Ram and Rambo Gaskin, have continued to say that the project should be buried and dead. The president has said that he's trying to woo APNU. Where are we? How do you see this thing unfolding?
Well, I think in the history of PPP PNC competition, this must be one of the most bizarre theatrical playouts between the two of them, with the PPP acting most bizarrely. The Amila Falls controversy is the final acknowledgement by the PPP that the Parliament has some power. Having conceded that the Parliament has some power, what I find most incredible is that at the time we're recording this Sunday afternoon, it's possible that the President may be again speaking to the APNU or the PNC and simply saying, could you come on board? Could you help the program or the project to be sustained? And let's get this thing off the ground without asking the APNU or the PNC, well, look, this Amila Fall is our agenda. It's a national agenda. Do you have any agenda that is in the national interest of Guyana? No, I think this Amila Fall project could be saved. And it could be saved tomorrow. What the PPP has to do is to tell the PNC, by no means a historic international institution that has Guyana's interests at heart like any one of us. I mean, you've got to be ridiculous to think that the PNC wants a fleet of cars for their staff. No, they want good governance. No, they want you to look at the NIS. No, they want to look at the independent functioning and financing of Parliament. No, how could anybody in their right mind think that the PNC should not be dealt with? So I honestly believe this thing could be saved, could be renegotiated. All President Jagdeo has to say to the PNC, let us see what nationalist items you have on your agenda, and let's discuss quid pro quo. Having said all of that, I'm not a financial expert, but I went through this thing. I put the papers under my lamp many nights and I looked at it. I think the deal is a bad one in terms of the investors getting too much. And I believe you can bring it down to a simple motor car. If you're buying a motor car and a guy is selling you it quite expensively, go and look for a similar motor car with all the accoutrements, all the capacity, and buy one that is cheaper.
Takumo, the experts have all said that this project, from an economic and financial standpoint, is a disaster. The former speaker, Ralph Ramkaran, who has really been throwing some bombshells over the last couple of months, said in today's papers that the authoritarian method of the PPP was responsible for the calamity that we find ourselves in as regards to the project. And I think Freddie is hinting at that. Could you speak to that?
I think he's right, but I think we have to see the crisis surrounding the Amila project as a reflection of the contradiction in the society between the criminal cabal who control the PPP and who use the state for their own personal empowerment and the question of the national interest. Hydro is important to the national interest, but the manner in which the PPP seek to develop hydro, hiding the details, entering into all kinds of transactions that are, questionable, is their way of satisfying the demands of the criminal elements that surround the party and the state. And I think that for me, at this juncture, I am very pleased that at least APMU stood the ground and helped to defeat this, I call it a criminal project. And I think we have to make a distinction between our needs as a country to have hydro and the manner in which this particular project was being thrust, onto the nation. And we have a number of examples. We have the airport, we have Skelter, we have a number of issues. If this government was serious about hydro, they would have dealt with it totally differently. Another point I think we got to recognize, my sense is that the PPP probably have come around to accept the logic that this project wouldn't spin. But I think that the political strategist in the PPP is trying to use the Milo, knowing very well that certain parties had vested interests, connected to at least one financial partner into the thing, to see how we could rupture the joint opposition unity. And I think we must recognize they were successful in doing that. Politically, they succeed in having the AFC voted with them against the APMU. And I think that, yes, they did lose out on the project, but I think they have opened the door. And we've got to be very careful for collaboration between them and the AFC, and the possibility of driving a wider rift between the joint opposition in the parliament. I think that we have to be grateful to Dr. Clive Thomas, and we have to be grateful to Mr. Greenwich, Rambo, Christopher Ram, and all of those patriotic elements who have really fought hard to expose this project and to help to push the tide against the implementation, because this would have been a great disaster for the nation. And it was only in power, the already empowered and rich elements around the state, because I am sure that a lot of that financial arrangement have a lot of payback for elements in the government and in the state.
Former President Jack Dio, over the last couple of days, said that those 4 persons mentioned killed the hydro project. And I think he singled out Professor Thomas for what he calls charlatan economics. I think that in the process they do what they do well, which is to say, look, this thing doesn't have broad support. It's these 4 men who killed this thing. But those of us who are on the ground and work among the ground know that the sentiments expressed by Professor Thomas and the others are sentiments that are deeply rooted in the psyche of the people of this country. That they recognize that the Milo project has technical flaws, but they recognize even more importantly the point that you're making is the linkage between the Milo Falls and the whole bullying kind of governance that we've had to endure in this country. Freddie, was Jack Dio, has he crossed the line again?
I think Mr. Jack Dio comes within the tradition of a formation that we have never seen in the English Caribbean before. Gary in Trinidad was authoritarian. Mr. Burnham was authoritarian. But I think the political, I don't want to use the word depravity out of respect for the station, but I think there is something deeper that is psychically wrong with Mr. Jack Dio. And I think Mr. Jack Dio is on a crusade to prove to Guyana that I could do what I want, I could say what I want. And he has been able to achieve that because what he has done, he has taken over the leadership of the PPP with a cabal that finances the PPP. Now, when Mr. Jack Dio went to the convention center and speak about charlatan economists, I mean, to call one of the world's best economists, Clive Thomas, a charlatan, I mean, you're sick. But the PPP could do nothing about that because it was such a fantastic contradiction that hurt Mr. Ramatal, but he could do nothing about it. Here you have Mr. Ramatal telling Mr. Granger and the PNC hierarchy, let's talk, man, let's talk. let's see if we can save this site global. And then you have Mr. Jagdeo calling one of the great sons of Guyana a charlatan. It goes to show where Mr. Jagdeo is in charge of the PPP, Mr. Jagdeo is in charge of his government, and David and Takuma, I'm going to take off my political activist hat here and put on my academic hat. I think this country is heading for trouble unless there is a serious movement inside the PPP, either locally or the diaspora, to tell the PPP, look, you should pull back.
President Ramatar speaking in his capacity, and I'm trying to figure out in what capacity, but I'm assuming that speaking in his capacity as General Secretary of the PPP a couple of weeks ago at the party's Congress in Port Morant, basically said that he is not interested in sharing government and sharing the governance in this country with the other half. No. We have in the parliament a situation where the PPP got 48% of the votes, and it has 48% of the seat. It has 32 seats. And the joint opposition got 51, 52% of the vote, and they got, in the parliament, 33 seats. So what we have is a parliament reflecting the will of the people. We have an executive that does not reflect the will of the people. And here is the president saying that the PPP is not interested in the executive branch, which is the engine of government, in that executive branch reflecting the will of the people. So, Freddie, you're right. I'm calling Mr. Granger, and I say, Mr. Granger, let us cooperate in the national interest to solve this Amila Falls thing. But 2 weeks ago, you were saying that even if shared governance and power sharing is in the national interest, we in the PPP are not interested in that. Takumogunsi.
You see, I have a slightly different approach to this matter. I think the PPP will say whatever they want to see. And I don't expect the PPP to willingly say they're willing to share power. I think, you know, the question of power sharing is something which African Guyanese, American Guyanese, and other Guyanese who are interested in renovating the governance system of the country have to be prepared to fight for it. PPP will not give ground easy. And in terms of the present disposition in Parliament, you know, people say it's the will of the people. I think the will of the people would have, if the elections and the will of the people had been reflected by what happened on polling day, I think the PP would have been out of the executive. So I don't see why the Parliament has the will of the people. But I understand this is what we have.
I mean numerically. I'm not talking by their actions. Okay. They're not acting as though they're acting to carry out the will of the people. The people gave them a mandate with a majority. And they interpret that mandate to mean, they interpret that mandate in a very narrow way, in the sense it means that you have to go to Parliament and you have to cooperate with the government, rather than seeing the mandate as one to renovate governance, as you say. So we are at one on that, but continue.
Yeah, so I'm saying that, you know, the president could say what he said because the opposition, especially the main opposition, which is the APMU, have given them a kind of a level of comfort which it doesn't deserve to have. You know, and one of my big problems, see, politics is, you know, you have to watch on what both sides do. If Comrade Granger says, you know, said that, look, the next major engagement in this country will be 2016, the next elections. What he's telling the PPP, look, you don't have to worry. We're not going to make any challenge between now and 2016 to change anything significantly in Guyana. You see, the PPs are political people. They're reading what he and the opposition is doing. And then they recognize, look, we have a lot of space for maneuver. And then they're going to start to behave in the old way. You see, when the PPP say they're not interested in sharing power, they're also using that as a certain kind of way of creating certain kind of psychological warfare on the African community, Amerindian community, and other opposition communities, you know. And I'm saying that, you know, we have to recognize that, and we have to stop trying to negotiate reasonableness with the PPP, and instead create conditions on the ground, which the logic that confronts the PPP is one that either they share power or they be out of power. And I think that is the way we have to approach it. It's pointless engaging because the PFP is playing political games.
And talking about creating conditions, it seems as though there is a movement within the African Guyanese community over the last couple of weeks to begin to organize themselves outside of the political party. We had a forum on African Guyanese 2 weeks ago. We had a march, the 1823 coalition holding a march today. We have initiatives coming out of Buxton and Linden and other places. Freddie Kissoon, do you think that there's a movement there towards a kind of what Walter Rodney would call self-activity on the part of African Guyanese?
Well, I think
and their friends.
I think it has emerged. It has emerged with the starting point being Linden. If you're going to write a history of struggle in this country, that July 2012 issue, I want to use a better word, that July 2012 struggle in Linden over the electricity crisis is in fact one of the most serious manifestation of post-colonial attempt at liberation. But I think we're forgetting also that about a few dozen people in Plaisance told the government, you're not putting up a governance tower on this ground. This ground belongs to us. David and Takuma, I was there from the beginning, and Takuma was there. I am telling you, I just sense it inside of me that there would have been bloodshed and serious confrontation if they had gone ahead and bullied those people, and those people won out. So I believe it started already. They went and they burned vendors' goods and stall in Perica last November. The group, the People's Parliament, which Ogun and all of us, you and we went, we confronted them. We formed a barrier. We said, you can't do that. We've taken the matter to court. So it has started. The 1823 monument, that caricature that is put by the seawall, has not been recognized. David, you know the press conference that was called by the 1823 Coalition for Parade Ground. I made the point that, David, not one organization in this country, including the sycophantic private sector commission, not one organization from Springlands to the Venezuelan border has said that is the right place to put that monument. And I believe African resurgence, the reclamation by African that this is our country too, I think it has started.
And we forgot to mention the vendors in the confrontation with the town clerk. A resurgence of African Guyanese, Takuma Gunse?
I think a clear resurgence at least began in no unquestionable way, in the way in which the African Guyanese community responded to the last elections. I think if anyone had any doubt about where African Guyanese feelings is in terms of the situation in the country, I think the elections would have shown where the masses think. Unfortunately, the masses and the leadership had a disconnect in the way in which the leadership dealt with the elections and the post-election struggle. I'm very heartened that we seem to be reaching a point where there seems to be broader consensus among the African Guyanese community that we cannot think about African leadership in the old conventional way in which, you know, we see it mainly in the political party leadership. And we seek to develop more leadership among our people by building mass organizations and groups in the villages and the community that could exercise, you know, political influence on the process, independent of what the party, you know, do. And I think this is a good thing. I mean, historically, the problem we had in the African community, that the PNC as a major political party in the African Guyanese community always wanted to be the dominant political player. Now, I don't have no problem with the one with the dominant electoral player, but I think there's a big difference between the dominant political player. And I think they work against their own interests and the African interests when they define political dominance, okay, wider than electoral dominance. And they put the foot on almost any independent aspirations among African people which they don't believe they control. But I think that we have reached a point where more and more African people are recognizing the limitations of party politics and is trying to, develop independent centers of political response. And I think this is important because it also creates more difficulty for the PPP. You see, and it also creates the possibility for there to be grassroots unity between African and Indian working people and village people at the grassroots levels that get over the old political divide. And I believe that the future of the country and the African community and the whole Guyanese community lies with more grassroots mobilization, that will confront the regime. And the political party and the opposition should see it as a helpful mechanism to them because they don't have enough resources to do everything, human or otherwise. And they should be glad that they could be helped along the process where other people are able to mobilize and put tremendous pressure on the state and the rulers, and the political parties could spend more time on fine-tuning the election machinery since their electoral, their electoral organs.
The Ministry of Home Affairs issued a statement, a strong statement, after the forum 2 weeks ago, singling out individuals and basically threatening people that if you continue to meet as African Guyanese to talk about your problems, that equals destabilization of the country, and that means that we'll have to cut you down. Freddie Kissoon, how did you read that?
All three of us here have some years age difference. I think I'm the oldest of the three, but we were all together around the same time. And I think you have to understand at our age, when you take so much of years, there has to be a sense of depression when these things happen, and there is no national outcry. Now, I was in this very room when that African conversation with African was being planned. I decided I would not attend because, for God's sake, let African people talk to African people, man. Let we white people and East Indian people sit down and listen to African people talking, because from my academic work, from all my research, African people are going through a terrible time in Guyana. I'm putting on my analyst hat now. I did a first degree, a second degree in history, both on emancipation. And I decided I will stay, I know my friends, let them talk. What the government has done, and the Ministry of Home Affairs has done, you have to contextualize it. Once that happened, alarm bells began to ring, because this government knows that the next form of struggle is the rise of African, the reclamation of African consciousness to a point where they're going to say, this is it now. So what they're trying to do is to tell Indian people, Africans are planning something. And in this respect, I appeal to my race, and I appeal to the Indian decent elements of my race. I could just rattle off of my head. Moses Nagamutu, Kemach Ramjatan, Rupert Rupnarain, Janet Bulkan, Christopher Ram. Let us go and talk to Indian people. Let us go now, because David and Ogun, I sense from my analytical research, things are not going to be nice in a few years to come, and less than 2 years.
Takuma, your thoughts on the statement by the Ministry of Home Affairs, which none of the major political players and political public. Go ahead.
Yeah, because I'm saying that one of the tragic things about Guyanese politics as it evolved in recent times is that we allow the PPP to get rid of the lot to get with a lot that they ought not to be able to get rid of a democratic and a decent society. I remember when the WPA held two meetings. We had one at the Topical market and we had one in Buxton, and then you and others made a speech, and then the commissioner of police went out of his way to threaten double pay people, you know, the political opposition, both the APMU and the AFC, said nothing. You have a commissioner of police who ought to be politically neutral. He comes out and threatens, you know, a section of the political opposition, and the political parties stay quiet. In that way, you given, you know, leverage to the Home Affairs Minister and the government to say, okay, this is acceptable political behavior. And we see the same thing happening here. Roy, using his position as Minister of Home Affairs, trying in the first place to intimidate the African community, and as Freddie said, also to drive fear into the Indian Guyanese community. It is part of their deliberate policy of driving fear. And to some extent they succeed, because remember, a number of persons from the APMU, Granger was there, one person, and everybody who attended that thing knew that there's no discussion there of violence, no discussion of no open racist position. And to date, you know, none of the political parties have spoke to the issue. And unfortunately, AGDA, whose place hosts the thing, they rented to the group, felt under enough pressure and terror of the Home Affairs Minister and the government to try to disassociate themselves from the event, like if though something criminal had took place in AGDA's compound, and senior persons AGDA was there that participated in the forum. And I'm saying that this shows two things. It shows that the government have been able, through intimidation and collaboration, force African leaders to become collaborators. And the interests of some African leaders become so vested in the interests of the state that when the regime threatens us, they feel it necessary to protect their own skin and probably their own material interests, that they're disassociated from something that actually never took place, even though they participated in the process and know the impression the minister is trying to create was not the impression, you know, of what was happening there. And they can't stand up and to defend against those simple, straightforward issues. And the question comes, how could the leaders like those simply defend African fundamental interests against a hostile state like Guyana? And I think that, you know, here again, you know, the question of political culture and political leadership is important. And I think that we in the African community have to pressure the APMU, because the APMU gets a lot of African votes. That Comrade Granger and others, they can't sit down and be quiet. So this type of bullyism, intimidation. And Comrade Granger himself was also part of the process. And he knows very well that the impression that, you know, Roy is trying to create is totally, you know, false. And I think he should be foremost and forefront in defending the forum, you know, and throwing his weight and challenging Roy and the PPP to reveal the information to support their position. I remember when I went to Buxton months before the elections and I spoke about the African condition and I used the phrase about the Riot Act. They tried to bully me. Act the cave in, but I refused to be bullied. And I'm an individual, I have to organize an individual. You see, the PPP understand certain things. They know who's tough and who's soft. And what they have been doing with the African community is treating us with a medicine of toughness and softness. And we have to insist that our leadership on fundamental things stand up and fight.
The Takumo Gunse, my guest, one of my guests there on Walter Rodney Groundings, in case you're just joining us, yes, it's Walter Rodney Groundings. My guests today are Takumo Gunse and Freddie Kisoon, and we are discussing some topical issues over the last week or so. We've talked about the Milo Falls project. We've talked about what seems to be a resurgence of consciousness and mass activity on the part of African Guyanese. Keeping on that same theme, it has come to our attention recently that this jam zone thing that they're having has now taken on another wing, in the sense that banks are now giving loans up to $150,000, I understand, to young people. I assume they're giving it to everybody, but it's mostly young people who are going to Jam Zone, and it's mostly African Guyanese young people, that you can now get $150,000 loans. You get this money, and you have to buy at least 4 tickets to go to Jam Zone events. They tell you where to go and do your nail and where to do your hair and all of that stuff. This is a continuing of this entertainment politics that has been directed at the African Guyanese youth in order to compromise them politically and demobilize them politically. Freddie Kissoon, your comments.
David, I grew up in a post-colonial culture where I would find that so sickening, so pathological, and so nauseating that you don't want to talk about it, or you're lost for words. Isn't it an insult to African Guyanese youths that you tell them, go, take this money, go and enjoy yourself, and then you have to struggle to pay it back? The whole thing smacks of semi-civilized conduct.
It's racism. That's what it is. Because if racism is that you look at people with a skin color and you give meaning to it, and in this case you're saying you don't need money to open a micro business, you don't need money to go and send your children to school to buy their uniform and the books. What you really need money for is really to go and party and jam and wine and so on. And that is the essence of racism. I can tell you, Freddie and Takuma, so many African Guyanese older people with tears in their eyes. One lady today at the march with tears in her eyes came up to me and said, Dr. Hines, please, this afternoon on the television, talk about what they're doing to our young people. Talk to our young people and talk to them and tell them that they are destroying us. It has become so emotional in the black community. And I want to appeal, before I bring in Takuma, to appeal to young black people to understand that this is the height of disrespect for you when you get into that nonsense. We're not saying here that you should not party, you shouldn't go to Jam Zone and these things. That's not what we're saying. But we're saying to allow yourself to be used in that way is really ridiculous, and you all have got to push back against that nonsense, because you're destroying yourselves, you're destroying your culture, and you're destroying your children. Takuma.
I fully support you, David. It's really a clear form of very organized racism. I don't think, given the history of commercial banks in Guyana, never in the history of commercial banks, as far as I know, they have ever went out of the way to provide money for sporting and fetting. And I think that only happened because sort of important influential elements in the state use their influences on the commercial banks to get them to build that facility. And I think that we have to condemn it in the most strongest way. I am not convinced that no bank could tell me that they did that for economic reasons, and as part of the right of capital and capitalist institutions to try to make money. That is not they allowed themselves, they got sucked in, allowed themselves to play a hostile political role against the African people in this country, especially the youth. But I think we have to recognize that, you see, in politics you have to understand how the other side is. Politics like war. Both sides are planning, how this thing will play itself out. And you remember that post-elections, the YTC, the young people, YCT, the young people coming out of the APMU election campaign, they built up an alliance of young people that played an important role in the outcome of those elections. And you remember that they've staged a successful boycott of some of these very forces who are promoting the Jam Zone, and brought them to their knees. And you must remember that it is the politics that closed down that young people organization. And in so doing, they remove the leadership and create a vacuum. The other side watch the situation, realize that the young people now are left defenseless, because the political party are not interested in defending the young people. The instrument that the young people built during the electoral campaign that stand up for them disappear from the political scene, to suit, the machinations of the conventional politics and the party politics. and a political vacuum created PPP planners, people like Lumumba and them, who, mission is to deliver the African community the PPP or to destroy the African community in the interest of the PPP, recognize that this is a good opening to wheel themselves back into the African community, the young people, and to continue pushing the young people away from progressive cultural behavior and political behavior to line down on sport. And I think that this is a continuation of the kind of racist warfare which the PPP have systematically been carried against the African community, under the disguise, of entertainment. And we have to call it for what it is. Yes. And I hope that Comrade Granger and the APME leadership will ride those banks and to protest in the most strongest way. Because these banks, as you correctly say, would not provide that kind of condition for a mother, single parent, to get $150,000 from them. They will ask all kinds of, and we have to call upon our leaders to, come out and put pressure on these institutions that are collaborating with PPP and behaving in that particular way.
And certainly you heard it here on the Walter Rodney Groundings Working People's Alliance, very strongly opposed to that kind of behavior. And we would have a lot to say over the coming weeks on that issue. But I want to say that Takuma is quite right that our leaders, especially leaders of the APNU, should really confront those banks, write to them and let them know our feelings on this matter. But we also should let our voices, or by bringing pressure and drawing attention to this issue, I think we ought to be organizing some picketing of those banks over the next coming days. So I want to say, look out and listen out for the word when we will have to go and protest in front of those banks. Now, they get away with a lot of this nonsense because they do these things and we do nothing about it, And so we've got to begin. Let us understand nothing is wrong with talking, nothing is wrong with picketing. Everything is right about those things. It is not the picketing that is the problem. It is the intent behind the picket and what you're picketing for, what you are saying when you're picketing. A picket can be the most revolutionary thing if there's revolutionary intent behind it, rather than just going out there and hold the sign. So I want to call on all the African organizations, and even East Indian organizations, because East Indian young people are also, especially poor ones, are also affected by this, that we all should come together and let our voices be heard on this assault on our young people and this really sickening form of racism that is continuing in this country. This is Walter Rodney Groundings, and my guests today are Freddie Kisoon and Takuma Ogunsi. Yussi Kwayana is one of the household names of Guyanese politics, certainly in the period up to the 1990s. Kwayana was born in Lusiknan, grew up in Buxton, and became involved in national politics in 1947 when he joined the PAC and was one of the chief campaigners for Dr. Jagan, who won the East Coast Demerara seat to enter Parliament in 1947. Kwayana was one of his chief campaigners. Kwayana would become one of the founders of the People's Progressive Party. He was Assistant General Secretary. And when that party won elections in 1953, he entered Parliament and also became a minister in government, Minister of Works and Communication. It was in that capacity that he dared to speak to the governor in a particular kind of way. A governor who was trying to meddle in the work of Kwayana's ministry. And Kwayana would say to the governor, please stop it. I would not stand for this confounded nonsense. Guyanese folklore would change that to say, this confounded nonsense must stop. And Kwayana himself was very much part of the debate within the PPP and the way forward. At the time of the split in 1955, for example, Kwayana did not go with the African group that left under Mr. Burnham. He stayed on in the PPP. But would in 1957 leave the PPP because the PPP, in his view, had begun to see race as the primary form of mobilization as opposed to class. He would join the PNC, became General Secretary of the PNC, but would part company with the PNC when he argued that race had become fundamental to the politics of the country and African people needed defense. And in that regard, he formed the African Society for Racial Equality with others, including Ras Tom Dalgety, who is still with us today. And the African Society for Racial Equality would make the first major call for power sharing in this country, when Kwayana, on behalf of that group, called for what is called joint premiership between Mr. Burnham and Mr. Jagan as a way of settling the problem. Neither Mr. Burnham nor Dr. Jagan took on the African Society for Racial Equality's call for joint premiership. Kwayana would say that joint premiership should be the way forward, but that if the leaders did not want joint premiership, in order to avoid bloodshed in the country, he argued that perhaps they should consider partitioning the country in an African zone, an Indian zone, and a zone for those who want to live together. Today, many analysts remember joint premiership, remember partition and not joint premiership, which was the gist of Mr. Kwayana's proposal. In 1964, Kwayana would form the African Society for Racial Equality, the African Society for Cultural Relations with Independent Africa, known as ASCRA, which today, to my mind, remains the most influential and effective Africanist organization in the history of this country. Through ASCRA, African Guyanese would be afforded education. ASCRA would run education classes. ASCRA would introduce African Renaissance in this country. Today we take it for granted that our children would be called Kwame and Abina and Kofi, thanks to a UC Kwayana and ASCRA, which introduced the Cultural Revolution. Tukumo Ogunse was part of that, and bringing about a renaissance in the African community. Kwayana, although he parted company with the PNC, would continue to support the PNC. He played many roles in the early PNC government as chairman of the GMC, the Guyana Marketing Corporation. He was also playing an important role in the formation of the Core Bank and other institutions, land reform, and so forth in this country. But he would part with the PNC finally in 1971 on the matter of corruption. He challenged the PNC government at the time to clamp down on corruption, and failure to do so, he went before the ombudsman and took his case there. The split between ASCRA and the PNC would lead Kwayana and ASCRA to link up with other progressive organizations such as Ratoon, led by Clive Thomas at the University of Guyana, IPRA, led by Moses Bagwan, and the Working People's Vanguard Party, led by Brindley Ben at that time, to form the Working People's Alliance. The Working People's Alliance would be strengthened with the coming back to Guyana of Dr. Walter Rodney, and later on persons such as Dr. Rupert Rupnarayan and Andaye and Omowali and so forth. Kwayana would continue to play an important role in the WPA. He was the person responsible for the WPA publications, the Day Clean, the Open Word, and all those publications that played an important role during the time of the WPA. He would come, the WPA being one of the major players during that time in the struggle against authoritarianism. He would, in 1985, re-enter Parliament as a parliamentarian for the Working People's Alliance. And when he entered the Parliament, he vowed that he would plant the seed of rebellion, the seed of Walter Rodney's rebellion in the National Assembly. He went there and for the first time got the political parties to agree to a motion calling for national unity, which was unanimous. This was proposed by Kwayana and pushed through the Parliament. With the coming to power of the PPP and the PNC into the opposition, Kwayana continued with the WPA. He was also a founder member of ACDA, the African Cultural Development Association. Ever since that time, he has continued to comment on Guyanese politics. Kwayana has the rare distinction of being the person who wrote the party song for the PPP. He wrote the party song for the PNC. He wrote the party song for the WPA.
And the affirmation for Agda.
And the affirmation for Agda. Kwayana is a political activist, but he's also an educationist. He founded a school in Buxton called the County High School, later renamed the Republic Cooperative High School. He was also a village politician, village political activist, sorry. He was a member of the city council and continued. He founded several organizations in Buxton and other African Guyanese communities. Eusi Kwayana, therefore, is one of those rare persons that our country has produced, and we want to make it possible that young people can access Kwayana. It was quite heartening this past month to see young people taking part in an essay competition where they wrote on Kwayana and his contribution to Guyana and Buxton. I myself get calls all the time from university students who are beginning to research the role of Eusi Kwayana. One of the things about our politics is that we've become so polarized between PPP and PNC, Burnham and Jagan, that we forget the role of other players such as Kwayana in terms of helping to shape our politics. Kwayana is seen as one of those persons who you could not point your finger in his face and say that he abused power or he was involved in corruption. I give you that long commentary on Eusi Kwayana to say that Buxton, his own village, will say thank you to him. We'll do a tribute to him on Wednesday the 21st. That's this coming Wednesday at the Friendship Primary School, beginning at 5:30. In the time that we have left, let me engage Freddie and Takuma, who both know Kwayana quite well, have been worked with him. Freddie himself has written glowingly about Kwayana over the years, and one of the persons who has kept Kwayana's name alive in the politics of our country. Freddie, let me open it up to you.
I'm very sorry that Brother Kwayana is not in Guyana, because I think when we have these moments of depression, you can go to him. And I just want to briefly talk about my personal relation rather than the analytical thing about him. Kwayana used to be alone many lazy afternoons in the WPA Center. And there are many times I would go in there and I would ask him about things, about my faults. You see, what is wrong with me? What am I doing wrong? And when I look back over those years, I wish he was here, that I could talk to him and that I could say to him, look, I wrote this thing in the papers and it didn't go down well. You see, could you tell me why I did that? And in that respect, I miss Eusi Kwayana tremendously. I will always remember one thing about Eusi Kwayana. Let me say on this program quite clearly, my life has turned out the way it is, and I'm happy with the way it turned out. I'm happy that I am deeply, profoundly, and psychically anti-racist, and I think Kwayana played a part in that. Here is a man with an African name who loved his race, but had not one inch of dislike or disrespect for another race. His name is Eusi Kwayana, but he loved other races as much as any, and that is what inspires you when you talk to this guy named Eusi Kwayana. And I remember one lazy afternoon, I went to Kwayana and I said to him, he was reaching, I could remember it so well, he was reaching for a book on the shelf, and it was him alone. And I said to him, you see, people don't like me, they don't want me around, and you see, it worries me because I know I'm honest and my heart is in the right place. And he gave me a lecture about the middle class and how you must speak to them and the kind of language they want to hear, and they're not people that you could be direct with. And that conversation taught me a lot. Before we end, let me say this. He is one of the giants of the third world, not only the Caribbean. This is a very unique man, and I would appeal to him to come home as urgently as possible and help this country, because I think we need him.
Well, it's unfortunate that we handle UC just at the tail end of the program, because, I mean, to deal with the UC's political contributions with a 6-year span, I want to probably point out 2 or 3 things that are not, known in terms of IUC's influence. First, they want to, a lot is being written by the PPP, and the PNC about the UC, and we need to have some independent research, and hope young people will follow independently. I was brought up, under the stewardship of a UC. So whatever I turned to be politically and culturally, it's due to a UC's leadership and influence. In 1953, when the PPP were preparing to contest the elections, I think this is important because some of the problems of that period and the challenges still with us. In the party's debate, in the preparation, Koyano went out of his way to argue to the party leadership that they should not enter the elections trying to win the elections outright and to have to form a government, that they should try to enter the elections to become a major force in the parliament, and then use the time between that period and the next elections to go for victory, because he felt that the party was not very well organized among the people. The people's consciousness was not to the point that they could deal with the challenges that would come once the PPP, given this ideological position, comes to power. And I think, and Burnham and Jagan, they decided, no, we were going to power. And they go and they got power, and in 125 days they lose the power. And consequently, that we saw the split in the national movement, and we know what's the history of the country. I pointed that we have to, to look at a lot of UC's intervention, and from hindsight, to get to appreciate the depths in which, he looked at his politics and the objectivity he brought to it. I only have time for a second point. I remember when there was the big crisis in Africa after the South African invasion in Angola, and the Cubans had made a decision to send military assistance to Cuba. I happened to be in Cuba at a point in time when they were doing the mobilization, and the Cubans had umpteen discussions among the popular committees, and the Americans didn't even pick up that the Cubans were building volunteers to go to Africa. Anyhow, there came a point in time when Burnham was not willing to allow the Cubans to use the Atkinson Highway because of concern about the Americans. And I was in Boxer when the Cuban representative came to Koyano and pointed out to Koyano the difficulty. And Koyano and Ascrio wrote, at the time we had Ascrio drums, a stinging attack upon Burnham, challenging his so-called commitment to African liberation. And within a few days, Burnham changed his mind and allowed the Cubans to use Angola, and we know it was the history of the Cuban saving Angola. I don't think we could say much. There's so much more, the things that is not known, I think, ought to be known. And I came today preparing for a whole program about the UC.
And I shall bring you back for that whole program next week, because next week we'll be doing an entire program on a UC. We wanted to introduce it this week. And so, yes, the tribute to Brother AUC Koyana in Buxton on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. What we have done in Buxton is we have invited all the organization that Koyana was involved in. The PPP, the PNC, ASCRA, AGDA, all of them. We have even invited the AFC, which he was not involved in, because Koyana was a national treasure. And so therefore we do not want to confine any celebration and tribute to Koyana to a small group. We wanted to make it national, and we think that it's only fitting that we do so. I want to join with Freddie and Takuma to say that I myself am a product of Koyana, growing up in Buxton, and Koyana has had a tremendous influence on my outlook, my whole attitude to public service, my whole attitude to politics. I think that in AUC Koyana, Guyana has produced one of its finest. Until the next time, this is David Hines, thanking you for tuning in to yet another edition of the Walter Rodney Groundings. And remember on this program that our motto here is to disturb. Mr. Roy and the others said destabilize. Yes, to destabilize that which is bad and to bring into being in this country something that is wholesome. And remember, we said that we want to keep this program in the air. Please call the WPA office and make whatever little contribution you can make to Walter Rodney Groundings to keep it on the air. Good night.